For years, Russia has been using the Kaliningrad exclave to pose a constant threat to the Baltic region and NATO's eastern flank. But now a warning has been delivered. Play around and you'll lose Kaliningrad. A key Baltic official has just told Russia that NATO has everything that it needs to raise the entire Kaliningrad fortress. Putin's grip is starting to slip. If he pushes too far, Kaliningrad will once again become Europe's Königsberg. It was Lithuania's foreign minister, Kęstutis Budrys, who made the massive claim. In a May 18th interview, he acknowledged that Putin has done everything that he can to turn Kaliningrad into a small fortress. Air defences have been sent to the exclave, likely in preparation for the sort of aerial assault that NATO would launch against it. There are missile launchers and much more in Kaliningrad, all of which Putin is trying to use to threaten NATO's eastern flank. But none of this matters. For Budrys, the key for NATO is to demonstrate to Putin that the alliance can shatter Kaliningrad whenever it chooses. Then came the message. NATO has the capability, if necessary, to raise Russian air defences and missile bases there to the ground. This isn't a boast. There is no arrogance attached to this statement, as revealed by Budrys, also noting that NATO needs to take the threat that Russia poses on the eastern flank far more seriously. What we're seeing here is a flat statement of fact being delivered by a man who knows that Russia has too much to gain from allowing NATO to believe that Kaliningrad is impenetrable. At least it's a fact in Budrys' eyes, as he has basically threatened Putin with the possibility that Kaliningrad can become Königsberg once more. But can NATO really raise Russia's exclave fortress to the ground? The simple answer is yes, and we'll explain why in a moment. First, Russia isn't happy about Budrys and his bluster. Just hours after Lithuania's foreign minister made his comments, Putin sent his favorite mouthpiece, Dmitry Peskov, to deliver a rebuttal. As usual for Russia, it was a statement tinged with hypocrisy and a strange sort of self-satisfaction that attempts to hide the fact that Russia is more worried about these claims than it lets on. That statement verges on insanity. I don't think it should be taken seriously. Rather, this shows the blatancy of politicians over there, Peskov said before adding, "Such blatant politicians can hardly take well-thought-out or sophisticated actions. This is good." This comes from a spokesperson for a nation that thinks that sophisticated actions amount to throwing meat into the grinder in Ukraine. And as for blatancy of politicians, Peskov is no stranger to warning of escalation with the West whenever any hint of support is shown to Ukraine. Let's come back to Budrys in his comments. Lithuania's foreign minister says that Kaliningrad is a problem but that NATO can raise it. He's right on both accounts. Kaliningrad has indeed been turned into a fortress by Russia, and this is work that has been undertaken even before Putin launched his Ukraine invasion. CNA, which is a non-profit that offers national security analysis, points out that Kaliningrad's military strength was relatively weak from the 1990s up until 2016. Then, something changed. In the aftermath of Russia's initial campaign of aggression against Ukraine, Russia started to reinforce the exclave. That reinforcement escalated in 2021, as Russia sent the 11th Army Corps into Kaliningrad, giving the exclave a troop presence that numbered up to 18,000, along with missiles, warships and other weapons such as tanks, artillery and mobile rocket launchers. There are also fighter jets in the oblast, primarily Russia's Su-30, Su-27 and Su-24 aircraft, and the Baltic fleet, which contains 52 of Russia's surface ships, regularly stations vessels at the exclave. Putin clearly had plans for escalation in Ukraine, as we later found out when he launched Russia's full invasion in February 2022. Everything that he sent to the exclave before that was supposed to bolster it so that Kaliningrad could be a threat to NATO's eastern flank both before and after the invasion. The idea was to take Ukraine quickly, turning it into Russian territory that, along with the puppet state of Belarus and Kaliningrad itself, would cause serious problems for NATO. That plan didn't work out because Russia massively underestimated Ukraine. But Kaliningrad still stands as a small fortress. It's just one that Lithuania's foreign minister says that NATO can raise to the ground, and he's not the only one. A similar comment has been made in the past, only in far more exuberant fashion. Back in October 2025, the former commanding general of the US Army in Europe, Ben Hodges, rubbished the defenses that Russia has built in Kaliningrad. If Russia attacked Poland the same way that they attacked Ukraine, they would be destroyed by NATO air forces, plus NATO land power, Hodges claimed, adding that Kaliningrad would be eliminated in the first hours of any conflict between Russia and NATO. And it's not just the exclave that would have to worry. If NATO was serious, Russia would also lose Crimea in short order, along with its key port of Sevastopol, Hodges warned. There is a caveat here, but we'll get to that, so stick with us. Just a few months before Hodges made his comments, another US official, commander of the US forces in Europe, General Christopher Donahue, was saying something similar. He claimed that the NATO strategy for dealing with Russia on the Eastern Front, should a war ever start, included the rapid destruction of Kaliningrad. Standardized systems were already being developed to add to regional defense plans that have been in place for a long time, Donoghue added, and he pointed out that control over the air and sea space above and around the exclave would be the key to toppling it. Beyond that, Donoghue didn't say much else. He wasn't about to give the game away about NATO's plans. Still, we can't help but ask the question of what NATO's plan would be if it decided that it needed to turn Kaliningrad back into Königsberg. We have 3 officials spanning almost a year making the claim that Russia can't do anything to stop NATO in the exclave. But if that's the case, then what does NATO plan to do? Those officials might not be talking, but we have some ideas about what the raising of Kaliningrad would look like. But before we get to that, this is a quick reminder that you are watching The Military Show. If you're getting value from the channel, remember to subscribe so you don't miss any of our videos. So, the plan to raise. Here's how it would work. First, a naval blockade would definitely be on the agenda, especially if NATO decides not to simply burn Kaliningrad to the ground with aerial firepower. That blockade would play out in NATO's favors in terms of pure naval power. Russia's Baltic fleet isn't strong enough to break through, and its Black Sea fleet is locked up in the sea that lends it the name, as Turkey won't allow warships to transit through the straits that lead into the Black Sea, and even without that factor, NATO simply has more powerful and modern ships than Russia. It also simply has more in general, with 2,818 vessels in its naval fleet compared to Russia's 747 per Statista. Much depends on how many of these ships can actually be deployed into the Baltic region for the blockade. However, with most of NATO being Europe-based, it shouldn't be too much of a challenge to get enough vessels in place, especially if NATO is as fully committed to a war with Russia as an attack against Kaliningrad would suggest it is. Asymmetric warfare would be a challenge. Russia has learned plenty about using drones to attack targets during its invasion of Ukraine. However, Ukraine would also be a factor in the raising of Kaliningrad. If NATO is fighting Russia, Ukraine isn't about to step aside. It will likely send drone experts, much as it's done in the Gulf region, to help NATO's naval forces deploy interceptors to deal with Russian Shahid drones. Ukraine would also provide a pipeline to its maritime drones, such as the Sea Baby, which have already proven how effective they can be at taking out Russian ships. A third of the Black Sea fleet being downed by Ukraine's drones and missiles can attest to that. The point of the blockade is simple. Prevent Russia from shipping troops, equipment, supplies, and anything else into Kaliningrad by way of the Baltic Sea. That would leave Russia with the Suwalki Gap as the only option for reinforcing Kaliningrad beyond what it's already done in the exclave. But all of this is prep work. The raising itself will be fast and completed as part of a multi-domain plan. It's a fancy way of saying that NATO would throw everything, including the kitchen sink, at the exclave to take it down as fast as possible. The numbers game would come into play again. As long as European NATO is supported by the US, Russia comes second in the numbers game across the board. NATO has more soldiers, aircraft, ships, artillery, missiles, and armored vehicles. Not all will be needed, at least in the bombardment that cripples Kaliningrad, but the attack would be brutal and swift. NATO would deploy hackers to jam Russia's radars and command systems. Electronic warfare systems, likely provided by Ukraine, would be used to send as many Russian drones off course as possible, with air defenses mounted on ships doing the rest. Any drones that Russia sends from Crimea or the mainland would also have to get through Ukraine, the Baltic states, and Poland to reach Kaliningrad, so air defenses in those countries would also weaken Russia's counter. Bombers, fighter jets, submarines, and warships could unleash volley after volley of cruise missiles and bombs against the exclave, much as we saw the US do in Operation Epic Fury against Iran. The goal would be to hit so hard and fast that Russia is barely able to mount a response. So these strikes would likely come as NATO is creating a blockade rather than before. The blockade would then stay in place for as long as is needed to starve what remains of Kaliningrad of anything that it would need to even have a chance of launching an offensive of its own. Oh, and Russia has another issue. Kaliningrad only measures a little over 15,000 square kilometers. That's not a lot of territory to absorb an overwhelming aerial and naval campaign conducted by NATO. Nor is it all that much territory that troops sent in on the ground would have to take from Russia. So when Budrys and other officials say that NATO could raise Kaliningrad, they're not lying. NATO has everything that it needs to wipe Russia's exclave off the map and reclaim it for Europe. But you may remember that we mentioned a certain caveat that's in play and would certainly impact the possible plan that we've just laid out. That caveat is the United States. And Budrys explains why, stating, "Many of our plans are still based on the assumption that America will provide critical military capabilities such as satellite reconnaissance. However, if we want to defend Europe independently, we must rethink everything, including nuclear deterrence." Lithuania's foreign minister is correct. Much of the type of power that NATO would bring to bear against Kaliningrad relies on the US. be that on the technological front or in terms of sharing of intelligence. Plus, the US plays the key role of giving NATO the nuclear deterrent it needs to enable a conventional campaign against Kaliningrad. Again, Budrys highlights that fact, adding, "A nuclear power like Russia cannot be deterred without a nuclear counterweight of our own. As long as the US nuclear guarantee remains in place, however, we Europeans can concentrate on the conventional front line." The numbers certainly agree with him. The Arms Control Association notes that France and the UK, which are the only two NATO members besides the US to have nukes, only have a combined stockpile that amounts to a tenth of what Russia has. The US being in the game brings parity on the nuclear front, which means NATO can risk a conventional assault on Kaliningrad because any nuclear attack by Russia can be met in kind. But if you take the US out of the equation, then everything changes. European NATO would still have the firepower needed to take Russia's fortress. However, it would do so while facing the risk that Russia could reply not with conventional arms but with a nuclear arsenal that vastly outweighs anything that Europe has. The US counterweight is the big caveat to the Kaliningrad plan, and that counterweight may not be as reliable as it once was. On May 19th, Defense News reported that the US, under the Donald Trump administration, is planning to tell its NATO allies that America plans to shrink its pool of military capabilities in Europe. That claim comes from 3 unnamed sources, so it may need to be taken with a pinch of salt. But the gist of America's plan appears to be to scale down the contingent of forces that it makes available for what is known as the NATO force model. This model is essentially a pool of forces that can be quickly activated if a conflict occurs. The US may be gearing up to pull troops and equipment from that pool, which is a rumor that has some credence due to Trump having previously claimed that he expects Europe's NATO members to take over primary responsibility for safeguarding the continent. Whether this withdrawal actually happens and how fast it would be if the US moves forward with it is almost immaterial. The key point here, and the one that Budrys also makes, is that the US is essential for the plan to destroy Kaliningrad. Under Trump, the relationship between NATO and the US has often been rocky. That wasn't helped when no NATO nations came to support or aid the US during Operation Epic Fury. The Trump administration wasn't happy about that, despite NATO's other members having no obligation to join the war in the Gulf. Trump has also claimed that withdrawing the US from NATO is beyond reconsideration, which appears to mean that he's made up his mind about the US leaving. Of course, it's not as easy as that. Legislation passed in the US back in 2024 prevents any US president from ordering the withdrawal of the US from NATO, unless they have either a 2/3 Senate majority supporting the withdrawal or an act of Congress that permits it. But if the Trump administration finds itself blocked from outright withdrawal, The Guardian points out it could always pull US troops and commanders from Europe. But much of this is speculation. But it shows why Budrys brings up the importance of the US to the overall plan for Kaliningrad. Let's assume that the US and NATO will work together and the razing of Kaliningrad could be completed. The next question is, will a plan like this even be needed? Budrys appears to believe so. He says, "The idea that a conflict with Moscow would only affect Russia's immediate neighbors is a dangerous misconception. It's part of Russian propaganda. In other words, Europe and NATO can't assume that any conflict will be limited to the Baltic region. Kaliningrad will be a problem for the entire Eastern Front, and if it isn't dealt with quickly, Putin could use it to attempt to take the Baltic states and create a strong Russian defense that spans across the east. What seems almost like a military outpost could quickly become much more than an inconvenient neighbor if NATO doesn't act fast. The Suwalki Gap is a particular issue. Stretching between Lithuania and Poland, this narrow strip of territory connects Kaliningrad and Belarus. The major concern here is that Russia might one day launch a 2-pronged attack from those regions to take the gap and then expand both into Poland and Lithuania. Kaliningrad may not be a huge threat on its own, even with its military buildup, but if you throw Belarus into the mix, then NATO has a problem, and that problem could quickly become a reality. Belarus's dictator, Alexander Lukashenko, announced the targeted mobilization of his country's troops on May 12th, seemingly in preparation for some sort of ground operation. Belarus and Russia are also taking part in a joint military operation, which began on May 18th, that appears to involve practicing how to deploy tactical nuclear weapons from Belarusian territory. The razing of Kaliningrad may become a necessity if Belarus continues on its current path. It will be much easier for NATO to deal with Lukashenko if he's fighting out of Belarus alone than it would be to deal with him if Belarus and Russia are able to take the Suwalki Gap and create a 2-pronged front on NATO's eastern flank. So the message from Budrys is clear. Russia will quickly find out how vulnerable Kaliningrad is if Putin continues to escalate tensions. And interestingly, NATO, particularly its Eastern European members, could even claim some justification for destroying Kaliningrad. Professor John Bryson of the University of Birmingham in the UK points out that Kaliningrad is something of an anomaly in the geography of Europe. Extremely compelling arguments could be made for this territory to become an independent city-state, or even for this territory to be returned to its historic motherland, writes Bryson. That motherland was once Germany. could now be argued to be Poland. Either way, there are claims to Kaliningrad beyond Russia, and all of those claims involve restoring the territory to what it once was. Kaliningrad will become Königsberg once more if NATO raises Russia's forces to the ground. If Budrys is to be believed, Russia wouldn't be able to do anything to stop it. And it's not like Kaliningrad is the only territory over which Russia maintains a tenuous grip. Crimea is right up there with it, having been illegally annexed by Putin in 2014. Ukraine has never let that annexation go. Now, what was supposed to be Russia's ultimate stronghold is getting beaten down in a liberation campaign unlike any other. The shattering of Kaliningrad will be quick. In Crimea, Russia is being dismantled piece by piece, and you can find out how by watching our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show so you see more analysis from our channel. And thank you as always for watching.